Everyone, I want to thank you all so much for joining us today for the African Trade Network monthly event, where we have the opportunity to introduce you to some amazing people who are involved with government, who are involved with economic development, who are involved with trade between Africa and the United States of America and other countries. This morning, we are very, very pleased to have with us Mr. John Rocha, who is currently the Chief Director Trade Invest Africa within the Trade and Investment South Africa branch at the Department of Trade and Industry of the Republic of South Africa. Prior to assuming this role, a little over 3 years ago, Mr. Rocha worked as a business advisor and consultant. In this capacity, he was acting as the project manager for the Southern Africa Regional Gas Task Force Business Foundation. NEPAD Business Foundation, where he was responsible for driving the development of the SADC Regional Gas Master Plan. In addition, over the past 20 years, Mr. Rocha held several senior positions in Pan African organizations. He is our guest today, and we are so honored to have him as part of the African Trade Network monthly event. And I know that those of you who are joining from across the country and around the globe and on the continent of Africa are definitely going to be informed, educated, and inspired. Mr. Chief Director Rocha, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. Good morning to you and everybody in the USA, and to those in the African continent, good afternoon, I presume. Thank you very much to be here.
We are so honored to have you here with us. If you would just start out by telling us currently, there are at least 600 plus American companies that are doing business in South Africa. So there's a blueprint that's there already. And in the role that the African Trade Network is serving in connecting those in the United States of America who want to do business on the continent, explain to those who are here exactly what your role is in helping to facilitate those kind of relationships.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'm part of the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. It's basically together with, I would say, National Treasury, which is the Department of Finance in other jurisdiction, and also other economic cluster departments such as agriculture. The department that I work for is basically the one that defines the economic development policy of the country, the economic development plans, focusing particularly on industries, industrial development for the country. Within the department, we have different divisions or branches. I belong to the Investment South Africa branch. This branch is responsible for promoting South African exports across the rest of the world, and also promoting and supporting South African companies that want to invest in other parts of the world. We have another branch that is responsible for what we call inward investment, so companies from America and other parts of the world that want to invest in South Africa. But these companies oftentimes invest in South Africa with the intention of using South Africa as a springboard to then do business in other parts of the continent, be it in our neighborhood, countries much closer to us. And quite often, because of our economic stability and relatively well-established financial services sector, and also the industrial base that we already have, they use South Africa as a platform to launch their operations into the rest of the continent. So the unit I work for, which is Trade Invest Africa, is then responsible for assisting South African companies or even foreign companies that have invested in South Africa to then be able to penetrate markets across the 55 African countries. That's in a nutshell our job. And when we talk of penetrating African countries, it's both in terms of trade, what they want to sell, export to other African countries, and potentially if there are opportunities for them to also source goods from other African countries to sustain their operations here, or whether it's also investments that they want to make from the South African base into the rest of the African continent. So in a nutshell, that's the work that we do on a daily basis.
That's a big nut.
Yeah, it is a huge responsibility. We have a team, but also we don't work alone in the department. We have very strong linkages with the business community itself.
Mhm.
We also work with many other organizations, particularly our development financial institutions and commercial banks, in assisting us to undertake our activities across the continent.
With many, you talked about companies coming there and establishing, and then your organization being able to help them facilitate relationships in other countries on the continent. With infrastructure is always a challenge,
Mhm.
and the United States government is playing a role in that. Where are you all on the infrastructure? Because you have a huge percentage of the people in South Africa who are still in rural areas. So how are you helping to facilitate the challenges, whether it's with housing, whether it's with public transportation for people to get into those cities where the companies are locating and work is being done?
Yes, what we're doing as a country, primarily, currently, there is a process of developing a national infrastructure plan that's quite advanced, where different departments, but also provinces and municipalities are making their inputs into that. There is within the presidency an office called Infrastructure South Africa that has got at the core of its mandate the need to upgrade and develop and modernize South Africa's infrastructure, such that we are better placed to be able to service the economy. The Department of Trade and Industry itself, we have a unit that is responsible for special economic zones, which is the unit then creating conditions across the country, not just in the big urbanized areas such as Johannesburg, but also going into the outlying areas and the smaller provinces to make sure that the infrastructure constraints that investors may face are addressed at the source. The DTIC also has an initiative which is a special infrastructure program that works together with investors once they express their interest to make sure the infrastructure services that they would need to sustain their own investments is then created and ease any other constraints that they have. Obviously, there are challenges because in an environment such as ours, population expansion and growth is always moving faster than our own economic growth. But there are a big push across government to ensure that those deficits are addressed and done so expeditiously.
If you're just joining us, welcome. This is the African Trade Network's monthly event where we bring together thought leaders from around the globe, and particularly Africa, so that you can find out how you can do business on the continent. There are the stories about the many, many opportunities, Mr. Rocha, to do business in Africa. Yet there are also the stories where people feel apprehensive, like there are challenges. How do you address that? How do you help people to understand or perhaps direct them into places that can smooth out some of their apprehensions and concerns about doing business in South Africa?
The first thing is to say that the Africa, or the South Africa of 20 years ago, is remarkably different from what perhaps many people outside of South Africa or the continent know. Like any other nation, we have challenges. But from an economic perspective, I think the first thing to say is that just if we look at the number of how the middle class in South Africa and across the continent is growing, it's changing dramatically. But I think the first point to touch on that should instill a greater level of confidence in anybody wishing to do business in South Africa or outside is that the policy environment in itself has changed. For a very long time, the country was under an apartheid rule that limited participation in the economy. Today, it's a much more open economy than it was before. Secondly, the population has grown, but also with that growth, it means that we still have a very young and vibrant population in the country. And many of them actually have been able to improve their levels of education. So we have got a much better equipped human resources base that we had before. And the same applies to the rest of the African continent. And this is not to say that there are not challenges. There are, and they will remain with us for some time, but they are being addressed. So first of all, is at that level. The second one is that South Africa in the past, whereas it was heavily isolated from the rest of the African continent, but since 1994, we have undertaken a very deliberate and focused policy approach that was designed to integrate South Africa much more strongly with the rest of the African economy. And one of the first steps that we began to take as a country was, number one, to look at the infrastructure deficit that existed between South Africa and the rest of the African continent, and designated certain priority corridors wherein the department for which I work for currently, the Department of Trade Industry, began to then, together with those country governments, develop the infrastructure. So investing in roads, investing in rail, investing in ports. And today you will find that Mozambique, Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Zambia, and many other countries in our region have been using these corridors to not only import goods from other parts of the world to their own economies, but also to be able to export goods from their own economies, from their country to other markets, including South Africa. We were then able, via the new Partnership for Africa's Development that was launched in 2001, to then expand that similar approach to the rest of the African continent. And such that today, the NEPAD agency has developed a program for infrastructure development in Africa that is also beginning to reinforce infrastructure connectivity across Africa and between African countries. The deficit is still huge. We need to attract much higher levels of private sector investment. But that's sort of the enabling environment that we are beginning to create. Lastly, is also we realize that one of the big challenges for African economic growth is the fact that we are still very dependent on exporting raw primary products. You know, in other words, we export raw material but import finished goods. And there is a very strong push across the African continent, including within South Africa, to invest in value addition, to beneficiate our minerals, such that we can then drive a higher level of industrialization across South Africa and the continent.
Speaking of 1994, and of course, you know, I was working on television news at the time when Mr. Mandela was released from prison and had an opportunity to interview his eldest daughter, who just happened to be in the market that I was working in at the time, Mayakiziwi. Since then, since the transition from apartheid to the Black and brown people having more of a role, has it moved as quickly as one might have thought?
I don't think anybody in government would say that it has moved as quickly, because there are still many challenges. But is the country better off than it was back in 1994? The answer is absolutely and correct, that it has. But as a government, one of the first policies that the country undertook and committed to was to address the legacy of apartheid and the economic imbalances and the disparity that existed between, let's call it, the minority white population and the majority Black population. And that's where the policy of Black economic empowerment stepped forward to begin to minimally address the disparity that existed at that point. But as with any policy framework, you can plan one course of action, but there are always different forces at play. And the impact that you expected to have may not be the desirable at that particular time. And so we have gone through different stages of reviewing and trying to improve the policy framework. And as a DTIC, one of the areas that we have realized, in addition to the Black economic empowerment, is having a very focused program to develop what we call Black industrialists. In other words, to begin to promote the development, the emergence of a new era of industrialists across the country, besides those that already exist, so that by doing so, you are then able to also diversify the economy itself, be able to create more jobs, and be able to create more economic opportunities for the rest. So that's the first thing that we did as a country. But today, in an era of green economy as well, we are constantly looking for those products that South Africa can begin to produce that we did not produce in the past. So today, there are already very good projects. We have, for instance, just in producing solar energy, it's happening very strongly in one of our provinces, the Northern Cape. There are large-scale investments in green hydrogen as well. There is a very strong policy pertaining to our blue economy, the oceans economy as well. How can we best optimize our oceans economy? There is a big drive across government. As I said, South Africa is known as a big minerals country, but we do very little beneficiation of our minerals. So there is a very targeted approach to ensure that we don't export our chrome raw, that we can add value within the country. All of these measures are designed to grow the economy. But I think we are also very conscious that in order for these measures to succeed, it's very important that we invest in human capacity. So there are policies that government has developed that are designed to give bursaries to enable those who cannot afford to go to tertiary education, to universities, that government has created a fund, a bursary scheme to be able to support them, so that they too can be able to qualify, be better educated, and have access to better jobs. So there are a number of policy measures that government is taking. Obviously, each one, the impact has been measured. There are gaps, but we continue to strive to improve.
Well, the human capital involvement that you talked about, providing opportunities, because we're talking about people. You grew up in South Africa. You grew up under apartheid.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes,
so how is it? How's the process in helping people to overcome the mental aspect of what I can do now? How do you help people get through that so that they can move forward in the opportunities that are there?
Yeah, I would say that the approach is twofold. Number one, there is a national recognition that a lot needs to be done for us to move forward. And I think what happened immediately after the ascension to power by the African National Congress was to institute the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I think that was the first step to try and just, let me say, calm the spirits. It has its own measures of successes and deficits. The second one, I think, which is much more important, is to begin to deal with the human mindset, because as you said, it's not been an easy process. Yeah. It left very deep wounds in the lives of many people. It ended up destroying a lot of families and separating family, breaking down societies and communities. And there is a lot of baggage that remains with that. But I think that South Africans are very resilient people, very, very extremely resilient. And we believe that whenever we come together as a country and begin to focus on the job that needs to get done, it gets done. If we look from the time when the late President Mandela was released from prison, everybody was very apprehensive about what would happen, that the country would just fall into uncontrollable violence. But South Africans rose to the occasion as a country. We rose to the occasion and were able to then show to the world and to ourselves that we can do better. And we set the course, because when the ANC took over in 1994, the country was literally bankrupt. But we were able to then recuperate, to set the country on a new course of economic growth and development. And throughout that period, there were many, many initiatives where the country managed to pull together and overcome what appeared to be insurmountable obstacles. And I think one of the best examples that I can give on the resilience of the South African population, the country, and every South African of every shade and color is the hosting of the World Cup. Just a mere 15 years or so after freedom. And it was a very successful World Cup. And the country again pulled together. There were moments where there were very violent scenes just before the elections. The country again pulled together, black and white, and we were able to deliver an election in 1994 that impressed the rest of the world. So we need to draw from these lessons and know that unfortunately we don't have any other places to go to. You can immigrate. If South Africa is your home, your heart will always be here. And we just need to look at our past and then be able to say that if we're able to overcome what we overcome, there is no challenge that can really stop us. And I think that's the kind of mindset and attitude that South Africans have. And we are all pulling on that, relying on one another to ensure that our country continues to remain a shining light, not only in the continent, but across the world as well.
Well, South Africa certainly is positioned with your president being a member of the organization BRICS. Is it called BRICS?
BRICS, yes.
Yeah, so you remember that, and how and the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. How is South Africa positioned to really help Africa as a result of this dynamic capacity that South Africa has?
Our approach and policy towards the rest of the African continent has from the very beginning always been centered on three key pillars. And if I may add, let me say four, because then when one looks at the time horizon that has passed, the three pillars are much more relevant today. But if we look at when South Africa attained freedom in 1994, and given the state of the continent at that time, the first priority was to deal with the matters of peace, security, and democracy. And that's why you'll find that under President Mandela and also President Mbeki, there was a very strong emphasis on pacifying Africa. So you'd see South Africa getting involved in many peace efforts across the continent, particularly if you look at the Democratic Republic of Congo and many others that flared up in the continent. So there was a big drive and commitment to that because we realized that there was no way that South Africa as a nation can prosper or any other African country can prosper if there were flare up of conflict in our neighborhood and across the continent. We realized that we're interdependent and we needed to create a peaceful environment so that as Africans, first of all, we could exist in a very peaceful environment, and that would then be able to attract others who wanted to partner with us to develop our economy. The second, then we know that in order to create peace, we needed to democratize the continent. So if you look at the continent in the 1990s, you look at Africa today, even though there are still some incidents of conflict and violence and war in one part or another, but it's much better pacified than it was ever in the period before 2000. So that goal, I can say, has been achieved excellently, not necessarily because South Africa is or the success can be attributed to South Africa itself, but because we worked well with other African partners and even international partners to ensure that this was done. Now, from 2000 to date, the focus also then shifted. That there is, you can have a peaceful environment and good government, but if there is no economic growth, you run the risk of not having social stability. So you will not be able to address the insecurity. So the focus shifted on economic development, and that's when the new Partnership for Africa's Development, which many have forgotten about, was launched in 2001. But that period also symbolized the transformation of what was then known the Organization of African Unity into the African Union, which is the organization today. And the commitment there was, how do we energize Africans and African countries to work much more closely together and to realize that the future prosperity of the continent depended primarily on our own efforts. So this was done to realize the goals of the Kwame Nkrumahs and the Julius Nyerere of the 1960s and 50s, which was a vision that they had. And the presidents in the 2000s realized that we needed to start working on it now. All of that work laid the foundation for the launch of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement, if I may proceed, encapsulates a desire by the African continent, number one, to integrate. And integrate in terms of what? Integrate in terms of trade. As a continent, we trade mostly and primarily with all, much higher with the rest of the world. We spend about $600 billion annually importing goods and services from the rest of the world to Africa. We account of that amount, inter-Africa trade is between 13 to 16%. I'm sure you will all believe that that's completely inadequate for a continent as rich as Africa. So as South Africa, we believe that improving trade relations between and amongst African countries is critical for our own economic growth, is also critical for peace and security in the continent. But number two, we also realize that if we want to increase trade, our problem is that we produce very little. We are so dependent on importing goods from other parts of the world. Our industrial base is very poor. South Africa is much better equipped. We have deficits, but many other parts of the continent have almost no industrial base whatsoever. So if I may give you an example, we all know that Africa has vast areas of fertile land for agriculture, but we import around about $20 billion or so of fresh produce every year from other parts of the world.
Why?
So it's a combination of factors and requires another debate, but we are also asking ourselves that specific question, why? There are many answers to it. We can delve at it later, but these, we are realizing and saying this cannot continue. This has to change. And this is where the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement opens up an opportunity for us to trade, for us to industrialize. But we also then realize if we want to trade more, we want to industrialize more, there is an infrastructure deficit that needs to be addressed. We have an infrastructure deficit estimated at about $170 billion annually to improve infrastructure connectivity in the continent. Our infrastructure, a lot of it draws back from the colonial era. It was designed for one specific purpose, to take minerals from the mines and take it to port so that it can then be transported to other parts of the world, with very little, if any, processing done within the African continent. So the north-south link between African countries was not really there. And the program for infrastructure development for Africa that the NEPAD agency is leading is designed particularly for that. And as South Africa, we continue to do the little that we can to assist and to accelerate development of infrastructure. But that's work that is necessary to be done in order to realize the goals that the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement has set for itself.
In this African Continental Free Trade Agreement, what are some of the things that you all are working on to help investors? You talk about the needs that are there, the opportunities that are there. What are some of the things those that have joined us, those who will be listening later, what should they be looking for in this agreement that indicates that you want to bring more investors in?
The first one is currently Africa is constituted of 55 African countries. Each one of those countries has got its own sets of laws, policies, regulations pertaining to trade, to industrial development, to infrastructure, to economy, to everything. So what the AfCFTA is seeking to do is to harmonize, initiate a process that will get all the African countries to harmonize their laws, their regimes when it comes to trade, when it comes to industrial development, and when it comes to infrastructure. But also when it comes to many other areas that are necessary to drive economic growth. So that's the first one, to integrate the 55 African countries and deal with the economic disparities that currently exist within and amongst African countries. The third thing is then that the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is doing. It has defined protocols or legal frameworks around the following key areas. The first one is a protocol on trade. And the protocol on trade primarily states the following. Number one, if we want to increase inter-Africa trade, we need to deal with the tariff barriers that exist between African countries. Because if you look at data and research, it indicates that it costs more. The tariffs are higher for products produced in African countries to be traded with one another. That's number one. Yes. So that's number one. So the protocol, the free trade agreement, has given a period of 10 to 15 years where countries will then gradually reduce the tariffs if it is 35% to zero. And that will cover 90% of the goods produced in the African continent. So that's the first thing that the protocol, this agreement is doing. And we are seeing progress currently of the 55, 44 have ratified the agreement. It's fully in force. Almost 90% of the tariff schedules that are going to be zero rated over the next 5 to 10 years is being agreed to. So there is a fast pace and progress being seen in that respect as well. The protocol on trade on goods also defines one thing that is important to highlight here is the rules of origin, which states that what content must be contained in a product to be classified as a made in Africa product that will then be qualified to be able to be traded zero duties across and between African countries. So what it means for foreign investors is that rather than producing outside and exporting it here, we are creating a platform in the African continent, a legal framework where if you set up shop in South Africa, you'll then be able to manufacture here because some of the raw materials that you use to produce your product, you may be sourcing it from Africa already and trade it in the African continent at zero duties. So that is the first thing that I want to highlight. And in terms of the rules of origin, there is also progress. It's now agreed products is under just over 80% as well. The other important part of this agreement that I should highlight relates to services. So it's the protocol on services, because Africa spends about $150 billion annually importing services. Transport, logistics, engineering services, accounting, legal, and many others. And we're saying, how are we going to empower Africans to do this work if we're always importing, spending money elsewhere? And
so where are you importing from?
Across the board, across the board. I'm not going to mention specific countries, but across the board.
Okay.
So I'll just say in general, North America, South America, Europe, Asia, and every other part of the world.
Okay.
Africa's share of the services industry, South Africa is the higher. We capture about 10% of that. Many other countries don't even have. So those are matters that this protocol is addressing. We are not saying eliminate completely. We are saying we need to reduce our over-dependence on external sources to provide goods and supply services to us. We need to get people to come here and do it from here. So that's the other. Then the agreement also deals with issues related to intellectual property, investment protection. It deals with copyrights. It deals with also the question of women and youth. We have a very large women and youth population, and it also deals with the digital economy. So what it means is that across the African continent, this agreement is going to harmonize the legal and regulatory environment such that when an investor sets up shop in South Africa, you don't have to worry how is it looking like in Kenya, because there are some kind of commonalities between the different legal regimes. So that's what the agreement is doing. But from an economic perspective, is if you're looking at South Africa, we are about 60 million people in the country. If you look at the rest of the Southern African region, 350 million or so, the African continent, this agreement will open up a market of 1.3 billion people.
Wow.
That is estimated will grow to 2.5 billion people by 2050. In terms of GDP, we are currently at 2 billion. It's going to grow to over 6 trillion. Just the power of business, total business and consumer spend by 2050 is going to be almost $7 trillion of business and consumer spend. So that's what this agreement will do. And to those who are watching and those who are looking at Africa with interest, we are saying that if you visited Africa in the 2000 and you come back to Africa today, any country in the African continent, you will see the progress that is being made. And the African Continental Free Trade Agreement will simply open up much vaster areas of opportunities for those who wish to do business in the continent.
Mr. Rocha, what are the specific sector opportunities on trade and investment that the world, those who are watching across the globe, can capitalize on to help Africa succeed in this growing opportunity that's there right now?
I think the first one is agriculture. We have to eat. We need to feed people.
Yeah.
Agriculture is vital. Currently, we spend about $50 billion importing agricultural produce in different dimensions from the rest of the world.
That's so baffling to me,
Yes.
since knowing here in the United States of America that Africans were brought here for their agricultural skills,
Yes.
yet you're saying that on the continent that you're having to import.
We are importing. We're importing about 50
What
billion.
happened? What happened?
Look, we because of the conflict, because of many other issues that happened, we lost that capability. People could not work in the fields, and people just began to then focus on many other things that would generate income much more faster.
Yeah.
So that's the one reason. My answer could be longer if I delve deeper into the underlying politics of it, but I don't want to do so.
Okay,
Because
that's another show, huh?
Yes, but what I'm saying is agriculture is very important because of to substitute what we're currently importing, but because the gross projections in the agricultural sector are huge. Imports, demand in agriculture will rise to about $100 billion, and the World Bank estimates that it could become by 2035 or so a $1 trillion market. So there is a huge opportunity with a growing population, higher levels of economic growth and better incomes. We need to feed the African continent. The second area of priority is really to do, how do we harness the raw material, the mineral resources, the oil and gas resources that we have in the continent that is currently being exploited, but we are not adding value. Look at oil, for example. We spend about $120 billion annually importing oil and gas, refined oil products, when we have countries in the continent that produce oil. So which means that the oil producers are producing oil, it's going somewhere where it's being refined and then coming back as lubricants, as petrol, as diesel, as jet fuel, as many other things. And we're saying we need expertise. We need to address it. Fortunately, one of the African billionaires, Aliko Dangote, is building a large refinery in Nigeria. If you look at Mozambique, there is a lot of gas that has been discovered. And in the past, gas has been beneficiated. South Africa itself is importing gas from Mozambique for petrochemical industry as well. And you see across the African continent how these matters are being dealt with. In the mineral, copper, cobalt, chrome, the minerals, what we call the
form, and then those other opportunities where the specifics are shared for those. And there's an opportunity to join the African Trade Network so you can have access this kind of information on a regular basis. When you see Africa, what goes through your mind about the possibilities? It makes
Uh,
you smile.
Look, I've been working on the African continent for the past 22 years. And I remember my first trip to one of the countries. Uh, and I'll mention them for the sake of just showing you the progress that has been made. In one of my first trips, I left Johannesburg to Ethiopia, to Addis Ababa. And the flight departed Johannesburg at 2300 hours. Under normal circumstances, it's a 5-hour flight. In those days, this was back in 2001. And this is really the best example I can use to describe what is happening in Africa and what makes us very excited and willing to engage platforms like this to also share this story with you and encourage you to come. Ignore what you're hearing in the media. Come and see for yourself. And you'll see a different, you'll live this continent with a different perspective, whether you come to South Africa or any other country. It took us almost 24 hours to land in Addis for a 5-hour flight, because the plane had to leave from here to Harare and then went to Bujumbura in Burundi, then went to Nairobi, Kenya, and then flew into the Ball International Airport in Addis at around, we landed at 2 o'clock. To get out of the airport, it took me almost 6 hours. From 2 p.m., I only came out at 8.
Mm.
We went and we stayed in a lovely hotel. I'll not mention it because I don't want to market them. We stayed in a lovely hotel. Today, Ethiopia Airline is the best airline in Africa.
Mm.
Today, every flight you want to go anywhere in the African continent, with the exception of direct flights from Johannesburg, you have to connect via Ball International Airport. You go to Addis Ababa, which was destroyed. We knew Ethiopia for famine. You look at Ethiopia, the skyline is skyrocketing. Another country that I'll talk about is Rwanda. So across the African country, there is a good story, continent, there is a good story to tell. Go to Abuja, go to Lagos, go to Nairobi, go to Lusaka, go to Luanda, go to DRC even, that we only hear about the conflict. Go to DRC. It has highways in the city that you will not find in some developed countries.
Mm.
So I'm saying, come and see. We are here to assist. There is a lot happening in the continent that is very, very good. From a business perspective, if you look at the African countries and you thought that only South Africa is the country to be today, you will find that surrounding South Africa, their countries are awash with opportunities. You'll find across the African continent the same. Go to Egypt in the north, they are building a new city in Cairo. And many will tell us that Egypt is not really interested in Africa. They're looking to Europe and the Middle East. Not true. Egypt is also looking to Africa. So is Tunisia, so is Morocco. And so is in every conversation that we are having between governments. How can we harness the potential of the African continent? And our businesses in the continent are part of that conversation, and would like you in the USA and the Africa Trade Network to also be a part of this conversation. And we know that if you come here and you are open-minded to see what are the specific opportunities that you can capitalize upon, you will certainly find something that we can work together on.
Well, let me tell you something, Mr. Rocha. Kudos to Franklin Marshall and all of the people that are a part of the African Trade Network and other organizations that are working to change the narrative, because just as African Americans have been pitted against each other in making us think that we can't work together, that same narrative has happened, and thank goodness that that bridge is being you're bridging that gap. And Just imagine what it's going to be like when we're no longer hearing all those voices. We hear them, but we swat them away like a gnat. In June, let me just, I'm like you, that's another conversation. June of 2022, the G7 countries pledged $600 billion for infrastructure in Africa and Asia. I see you smiling. $600 billion. What is that going to mean for the economies over the next few years? Just in getting it built, for one thing.
Look, we welcome that. We welcome. I mean, nobody would not welcome that. We have an infrastructure deficit, funding deficit, estimated at $170 billion annually. So it's a lot of money. But that's the aspiration. Let us look at the reality. Let us look at the reality. Between 2016 to, I'll speak until 2021, investment, the value of projects that broke ground in the African continent. And I'm sharing this to change a narrative, because you started by alluding to what is done to keep us from engaging and talking to one another. And I'm saying that while those same people that are doing that, they are currently, as we speak, flooding the African continent and every country to say we want a piece of that pie. And those who have the heart to really come in, to contribute and to make a living out of it in a genuine manner are staying away because of what we are hearing in the media. And the ones who are promoting that narrative are coming. So they are keeping everybody else away, but they're coming. Now, I was stating the value of projects that broke ground in the African continent, covering 13 sectors, from construction, agriculture, energy, transport, so railroad, bridges, everything else, oil and gas, healthcare, housing, you spoke housing earlier on, mixed-use development, retail outlet, factories, water and sanitation projects. All of that, the value of projects that broke ground, I'm not talking promises, projects that broke ground, average $450 billion annually. Now, you will ask the question, where does that money come from? 50% of that was funded by African countries. There's a lot of talk about China. 30% of that $450 billion comes from China. You know, the other developed countries that we know fund Africans' development, they cover the rest of that 20%. Private sector contribution of that was about 2%. Governments in Africa are carrying this cost. Even if China is giving a loan, it's not for free, it's being repaid.
Ah, okay. Did you see that comment? I'm concerned about the level of development by China and the lack of.
It's repaid.
Okay.
It's being repaid. We don't want to discuss the terms and conditions or whatever, but it's being repaid. Every money that Africa is borrowed, it's being repaid. But I'm saying that African governments and institutions are actually carrying a substantial amount of the cost to develop. However, no country, no continent in the world can undertake such a task by itself. You need partners. Europe needed partners after World War II. Japan needed. Africa, we also need partners after World War II. What is going to change is the terms of that engagement. How do we strike a deal that is mutually beneficial? So to say that $450 that I spoke about of projects that broke ground is from 2015 to 2021, and the data is there. Where you see the difference, and this is where the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, I'll touch on that question. I'll touch on that question of the Chinese logos. If I look at Santon, there is one or two that I know, that I see. But if you look at all the buildings where I'm talking from right now, it's African money. Go to Nigeria. You will see who's building and investing in developing Nigeria. It's Nigerian money in the main. And the records of the Nigerian Investment Center shows that. Go through Ethiopia, is the same. So we must refuse to accept a narrative that says we are not doing things ourselves. It's as if we are sitting back and waiting for everybody else to do it. We are doing it.
But you know
And that's
what,
why
Mr. Rocha, I think that's also part of what happens across the board when people of color are involved. If it's going
yes,
well, they want to give somebody else credit for it.
yes.
Don't you think?
Unfortunately, that's many of us. I used to have that position as well.
You did?
Until I started being part of the conversations where decisions are being made and you start seeing the evidence. The truth of the
Okay.
matter is the evidence does not back what is commonly known outside. Does not back
Right.
it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So and as I'm talking about investment and what's really happening in the African continent, this is the drive. This is what is driving. I'm not saying that international partners are not assisting. They are assisting, but they cannot claim the glory all to themselves. Now, coming to the announcement by the G8, the G7, if I look at the G7 membership and we look at the countries that are coming to Africa that have now, and many never had, they now also have an African strategy and an African policy. It's simply because they are seeing an opportunity.
Mm.
And they're seeing the returns on the investments that have been making and that they're making. And many of them have been studying and sending delegations to Africa to assess and identify opportunities, which we welcome. So I'm saying the announcement by the G7 is most welcome. There are many countries outside of the G7 that also have African strategies. And African countries, to be quite honest, unlike in the past, are also beginning to look at strategies they may have towards other countries from outside the continent. And we are starting to have those conversations because the AFCFTA is a game changer. It has made us realize that actually a lot of the funds that are flowing out of the continent to other parts of the world can circulate within the African continent. The African Afrexim Bank has set up a payment settlement system. Why do we need an African payment settlement system? Because when we are trading with one African country, if I'm trading with Zimbabwe, if I'm trading with Zambia, which is just here, if I'm trading with the DRC or Egypt, I have to route the transaction via London or New York. And I have to pay fees on billions of dollars of trade money that should be accrued into the continent outside. Our currencies are not mutually convertible.
Mm.
So I have to pay, I have rents to pay for a supply from outside. It has to be exchanged to dollar or to pound or to euro. And then when it reaches there, it has to pay in that currency and go through that same process backwards. So if I'm a South African exporter, I'm exporting to Kenya. I don't have Kenya shilling. So I will either pay rents to my bank, exchange that to euros or to dollars or to pounds to pay my Kenyan my Kenyan buyer to pay for me. And then the invest is the same. Throughout that process, I pay fees to the bank. There are other costs that are deduced from that. It adds to the cost of trade in the African continent. So that's why the Afrexim Bank has created an African payment settlement system. And this is all part of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement so that transactions can be settled using African currencies and exchanged between and amongst African countries. It will reduce costs. It will reduce significant costs. And it's good for outside investors because when you now invest in South Africa with your USD, it means your USD can carry you that much further and you can grow your business as well. So there's a benefit attached to that. But what we are saying, it must not be a zero-sum game. As Africans, we want to extract better value and optimize and sweat our assets, as they say it in business lingo. We want to sweat our own assets, which is our land, our resources, and the capacity of the human capacities that we have in the continent.
You have extended the invitation to come. What do you suggest? How do you, what do we need to look at? What do I bring that can help? And how do I get started when I get there?
Here is what I would suggest. I'm sure all of us have participated in endless conversations, and it's very good to have. But I think as business people, as consultants or whatever, you're actually looking at the bottom line and want to say, I want to look at the deal. And I think the best way for us to do it and unpack this is to have very targeted sessions. We can have one specific one that can unpack the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and see how you can fit into that, leverage on that. Second one, very sector, industry, project, opportunity specific. So if we're talking infrastructure, that we can have a 1 hour conversation looking where are the priority infrastructure projects, what is the funding needed to get those done, what information is available, and if it's agriculture, the same, and get you in touch, this conversation with businesses from across the African continent. If we're talking agriculture, that can sit face to face virtually with their counterparts to talk agricultural opportunities. And I think if we do that, it's going to enable us to then proceed with very targeted and focused missions where agriculture entrepreneurs can come, go and find with their counterparts, and everybody else in other industries can do the same. And I think it will make our conversations much more interesting. But on our side, we remain available. We're honored and humbled by these opportunities. We thank you for that effort. So we're just restating our availability to engage.
Well, let me just tell you, this has been very informative. I mean, I think that all of those who are watching now and who will be watching later would agree that it is good to hear firsthand and have these extended conversations that are not limited by sound bites. So thank you. Thank you for your time today. And we really appreciate that suggestion and welcome you back anytime. And in particular, there's going to be a conference in October of 2023, the African Trade and Technology Conference. We would love for you to attend that and be a part of that with us. Is that a yes?
We restate our desire to engage. Yes. Thank you very much.
Excellent, excellent.
Yeah.
I thank you again, and that's a wonderful suggestion to just take one topic and have you and or those people that you recommend who are in those particular sectors, and then send out the invitation to people who are interested in that, and then come and sit and discuss exactly what people need to do, because the countries in Africa are experiencing a growth rate unlike any other place on the globe. Is that correct?
That's correct. I mean, it's been mixed. COVID-19 had a negative effect in between the drop in commodity prices, which the African continent currently still depends a lot on, has also had a negative effect. But in the main, even based on FMI figures, economic growth in the African continent will average about 3%, and some countries are growing at 7%, others at double digits. So we have good expectations, and I think the free trade agreement is going to boost that even further. So we're looking with very high levels of optimism towards the future, and certainly would welcome partnerships with yourselves and others that wish to join us in this very challenging but prospective journey forward.
Well, something that Barbara H. Smith she is a celebrity speaker trainer. She said, I want to be part of the travel industry between the US and Africa and the African continent, specifically Kenya and Uganda for now. How do you suggest that happen? Because you haven't talked about travel, and tourism is a big part of the industry.
Absolutely. Africa is a beautiful continent, but I think we share, particularly with African Americans, a common history that binds us. And I think this is where our roots come from. And being in the space that she is, tourism is key. The creative industry is receiving quite a lot of attention across the African continent, from north to south. Fashion and clothing is also receiving significant amounts of attention. We have started seeing African fashion beginning to penetrate some international houses as well. There may have been one or two controversies sometime in the past, but I think that she'll be most welcome to join that. And there is an industry in the African continent, particularly also here in South Africa, if I look at Nigeria as well, that would most certainly embrace her. But I think also, most importantly, is strengthening tourism between South Africa, between African countries and the USA. Not only them coming here, but we also going there is going to be critical, and we would most certainly be willing to welcome her as part of that party. Thank you.
No, sir, thank you. We appreciate you spending this time with us today so much and look forward to a continued relationship, very close relationship with you and the African Trade Network. I honor you and all of us who are watching, who are here in the States. We just feel like we're close to home when we hear you, and we appreciate you so much.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure and honor, humbled by your invitation. And to everybody watching, thank you. We look forward to further engagements in the future. Thank you very much.